So the next mode I want to discuss is color Doppler. But before we can get into color Doppler mode, I need to introduce the concept of Doppler shift. I am not going to go into detail on ultrasound physics of Doppler or the Doppler equation. We may do an entire discussion in the future on Doppler ultrasound physics. But for now, I just want you to understand the basics. So if we have a reflector represented by this gray circle on the left, and the reflector is still, then the frequency at which the transducer sends out or transmits a signal will be the same as the returning or reflected signal, because that reflector is still. So there's no change in frequency, and therefore there's no Doppler shift. However, if the reflector is moving towards the transducer while the transducer is sending out an ultrasound frequency, then this area, because it's moving towards the transducer, is compressed. And because that area is compressed, then the returning echo has a smaller wavelength. And as you remember from physics, if the wavelength is smaller, what happens to the frequency? Well, the frequency increases. So therefore you have a positive Doppler shift because it's moving towards the transducer. How positive the Doppler shift is and how much the frequency increases depends upon the speed of the reflector. So the higher the speed, the higher the increase in frequency, and the more positive the Doppler shift. The opposite is true of a reflector that is moving away from the ultrasound transducer. As the ultrasound transducer is sending out a signal, this area is not being compressed, but it's actually lengthening. Therefore, the ultrasound signal that returns has a larger wavelength than the one that was sent out. And when you have a larger wavelength, you decrease your frequency, and you have a negative Doppler shift. And again, how much you decrease the frequency and how negative it is depends on the speed of the reflector. The faster it's going away from the ultrasound transducer, the more of a decrease in frequency you have, and the more the negative Doppler shift will be. Think of this in terms of the ambulance example. If this reflector here is an ambulance, and it's moving towards your ear, it compresses these sound waves as it's coming towards you, and the siren pitch increases. If this is an ambulance, and it's going away from you, from your ear, then the pitch decreases. And it has that sound coming towards you, wee-oo, 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 and away from you, wee-oo, 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 even though the original transmitted frequency or the original transmitted sound is exactly the same. Okay, now that we understand the principle of Doppler shift, we need to understand how the ultrasound machine interrogates or detects that Doppler shift. And there's two primary methods. The first one is familiar to us. It's pulsed wave Doppler. And the reason why it's familiar to us is because this is the same method that your B mode or 2D grayscale image is already being obtained. If you remember when we talked about pulsed echo, we said the ultrasound transducer has to have at least one crystal. And that crystal sends out an ultrasound beam. It stops and listens. It waits for the returning echo, and when it receives the returning echo in pulsed wave Doppler, it looks for the change in frequency or the Doppler shift between those two. The advantage of this is that you can tell it what specific depth you want to interrogate. And if you look on an ultrasound machine screen, when you hit Doppler, you can place a gate. And this is the gate right here. That tells the ultrasound machine, please tell me at this exact depth in this area what the change in frequency or the Doppler shift is occurring. The disadvantage to pulse wave Doppler is that you cannot measure high velocities accurately. So if you have very high velocities of movement or high Doppler shifts, then pulse wave Doppler is not able to interrogate that accurately. Now, I'm not going to go into the physics of this, just understand that principle. Now, there's a second method of interrogation called continuous wave Doppler. And as its name applies, continuous wave can happen continuously. Now, this you have to have a different transducer, and this is one of the disadvantages. And this transducer has to have at least 2 different crystals. And we'll say for this example, the top crystal is transmitting an ultrasound wave, and the bottom crystal is listening for the returning echoes. And the change in frequency, or the Doppler shift, between those two is detected continuously. Now, on the screen in continuous wave Doppler, you won't have a gate, but you'll see this area of a diamond. And this is because the entirety of this spectrum is being interrogated all at once, looking for the highest velocity. So therefore, a pro for this method is that it can handle high velocities. The con is that there's something called range ambiguity. Because you're not telling the ultrasound machine, oh, please interrogate at this specific depth, you can't tell what it's reporting, whether it's from the top part of this or the bottom part of this spectrum. But the advantage, again, is that if you have very high velocities, it can detect this accurately. Now, these 2 different types of interrogation can apply to the other different types of Doppler that we're going to look at now. Okay, with that under our belt, now we can actually get to the mode. So the next mode I want to discuss is color flow Doppler, and it is the C on the ultrasound machine. Now, color flow Doppler presents the Doppler effect velocity information in color over the B mode image. As you can see here, the B mode image is in the background. Then you hit the C button and place this color box over the area that you want to interrogate. That's telling the ultrasound machine, please tell me in this area what the Doppler effect velocity information is. And the machine detects that, then displays the information in color over the B mode image. Now, to understand what the colors mean, we need to look at this color map. Now, by convention, in the middle of the color map, there's a line. And that line represents 0 or no flow, no Doppler shift. So whatever is above that line is a positive Doppler shift, or flow toward the transducer, if you remember from our previous discussion. And you can remember that because you see here there's a positive number. Then whatever is below that line is a negative Doppler shift, or flow away from the transducer. And you can see that because there's a negative number. And those numbers are simply the scale or the intensity of the velocity. So how fast or slow it is moving, and is it moving towards or away. Now, as you can see from this discussion then, red and blue has nothing to do with whether the vessel is an artery or a vein. So please, the ultrasound doesn't know that. Please, do not make that mistake. It has nothing to do with whether the vessel is an artery or vein. You could stick purple and pink colors in this color map. It would still give you the same information, and then hopefully it would be less confusing. But by convention, red is towards, blue is away. You'll also note then the intensity of the color corresponds with the velocity. So the more intense that this gets from dark red to bright yellow, that's higher flow towards the transducer. The less intense, lower flow. The more intense this gets from dark blue to almost bright blue-green, the faster the flow is away from the transducer. Now, if you look on the right side, now we're going to discuss color power Doppler. And color power Doppler ignores the directional information. So where color flow is directional, color power ignores that directional information. And it takes the sum of the intensity of the movement. So it doesn't care in what direction the movement is, it simply cares how intense it is. And therefore, its color map just displays intensity from a darker, less intense to a brighter, more intense color. It ignores the directional information. The advantage of this is that it's very good at picking up low flow states, or it's very sensitive to flow. It also makes it very sensitive to motion as well. So many times people are using color power Doppler clinically when they're looking for low flow. Because if you turn down your scale on color flow as low as it will go and you're still not detecting flow, you need to switch to color power Doppler. And if you're still detecting no flow, then there is definitely no flow. So in summary then, color flow looks at direction and intensity of velocity, above, towards, below, away. Color power looks just at intensity and is good for low flow states. This image illustrates that. You have red and blue. So remember, red is toward and blue is away. So we have directional information. But the flow on the outside of the vessel is not picked up as well, because in laminar flow, the periphery of the vessel has lower flow. So it's not as sensitive. But if you look on this side, there's no directional component, right? You just have flow, yes or no. But it is much more sensitive to low flow, because you can see on the outside, you're picking up even those low flow states. The last Doppler application in the next ultrasound mode we're going to discuss is spectral Doppler. And I make the D red because it's accessed through the D button or Doppler mode on the ultrasound machine. And I'm not going to discuss the details of spectral Doppler and analysis at this time. It's a complex and detailed issue, but suffice to say for now, we've previously discussed Doppler shift as if it's a single frequency. Single frequency goes out, a different frequency returns, and the ultrasound machine detects the difference between those frequencies, hence Doppler shift. But in fact, it's much more complex than that. It's a complex signal that's sent out and a complex signal that returns. And what spectral analysis attempts to do is extract the individual frequency information in the individual Doppler shift and velocity information within that complex signal, and then display it graphically. So we have velocity information over time. And you can look at this graphical representation of that information and gain much clinical information and insight. But we're not going to discuss that in detail at this time. If you look at this image, though, we can tell that this is a pulsed wave interrogation. And that's because there's a gate right here. And that's telling the ultrasound machine, in this gated area, perform spectral analysis and display that information graphically to me. If this were continuous wave Doppler, what we would see is there would be a diamond here instead of a gate. And that would be telling the machine, focus your spectral analysis on that area, but in fact, we're interrogating along the spectrum of this whole line because it's continuous wave. Well, that covers the ultrasound modes. We discussed B mode, or brightness mode, your 2D grayscale image. We discussed color Doppler, where you depict Doppler shift information in color over the B mode image. We discussed Doppler mode, where you can perform spectral analysis. And we discussed M mode, where you can display motion over time. of a slice of the B-mode image. Next, we're going to talk about ultrasound artifacts.